A new Cold War? NATO is once again flexing its muscles in Eastern Europe. The alliance is planning to send combat-ready troops near the Russian border. But will this deter what's seen as an increasingly aggressive Russian policy in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abugaida. Britain, Germany and the United States have agreed a plan to send around 4,000 NATO soldiers to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, a decision that will likely anger Russia. It's NATO's biggest military buildup in the region since the end of the Cold War. Although the troops will effectively sit near Russia's border, NATO Secretary General says the alliance isn't trying to start a new Cold War. NATO says the deployment is needed to deter an increasingly aggressive Russia. Well, it's one of a number of measures being implemented by the North Atlantic Alliance to make sure its member states in Eastern Europe feel secure. And they include the creation of a 40,000-strong rapid reaction force, as well as a so-called Spearhead force that could be deployed in a matter of days. Now, Russia has long criticized NATO's expansion in Europe, calling it a threat to its national security as well as the stability of the continent. The bloc has expanded eastwards since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So this is what it looked like in 1990. And these are the countries who are now part of NATO in Europe after its most recent expansion in 2009. As we mentioned earlier, the latest announcement will see NATO battalions deployed in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, as well as Estonia. Let's discuss this with our guest. Joining us from Moscow is Vladimir Sotnikov. He's a strategic analyst at the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. In London, Ted See, senior policy consultant for the British-American Security Information Council. Washington, D.C., Magnus Nordman. He's the director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative. Welcome to you all. Magnus, so the ongoing military buildup along Russia's border is criticized by some, seen as an unnecessary provocation that threatens to destabilize the region. That is one point of view. Do you agree with that?
I really don't, because this is not self-triggered. This is not something that NATO came up with just one beautiful day. This is in response to the Ukraine crisis and continued Russian assertiveness in the Baltic Sea region and more broadly in Europe. So this is a NATO response and not something that NATO triggered on its own.
Ted See, Russia perceiving the activity as a threat. It hasn't yet announced any countermeasures. How do you think Putin will react? And do the Russians have the right to be concerned?
Well, this follows, as you already mentioned, a pattern of eastward expansion since the end of the Cold War in what seems like a never-ending pursuit of more allies closer to Moscow all the time. And despite what the last speaker just said, I would say that the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit in March of that year, which promised that both Georgia and Ukraine would eventually be NATO allies, was more than enough provocation of Russia and its repeated strategic red lines about no further expansion closer to Moscow to justify their subsequent actions. I'm not saying I condone what they've done in Georgia and Ukraine since then, but I certainly understand it in the light of NATO's complete ignoring of Russian strategic red lines.
Vladimir Sotnikov, how does this endanger Russian security, in your opinion?
Well, actually, I would like to say that this recent building up of the huge forces, NATO forces, at the Russian western borders, it's actually the step in the wrong direction, because I just listened very attentively of my esteemed colleagues from Britain and from other countries, actually, and I would like to say that Russia, because of Ukrainian crisis, is not the enemy to anybody, because Russia actually would like to put its strength for the universal fight against international terrorism, because just building up the forces of NATO on the outskirts of Russia is not the right thing to do, because we might think and we should think about fighting international terrorism. Just a vivid example of that was 2 days ago when in the United States in Orlando a man claimed to be a jihadi from Islamic State shot down 50 persons. And this danger actually existing not only for the United States or for Russia, but every country, including Europe.
Magnus, you heard what Vladimir was just saying, and also I'd like to pick up on the point that you made that this is in response to the Ukrainian crisis. So what was done by Russia 2.5 years ago, if that was an aggression, as some people call it, why is NATO then mobilizing in a completely different location in the Baltic areas?
Because what we've seen in the Baltic Sea region is continued Russian assertiveness with major Russian exercises over the last few years, and also no-notice snap exercises that are very difficult to predict where they're going to go. And just a few weeks ago, we had the close flyby of the USS Donald Cook in the Baltic Sea region. So this is not about a buildup in a region that's not related to the broader security environment. The Baltic Sea region is very much a key friction zone between NATO and Russia. And I should mention, as I point out, Georgia and Ukraine were mentioned, and they are not allies, but certainly the Baltic countries and Poland are full members of NATO and have security guarantees from NATO.
Ted C., how far will this ongoing tension escalate, if it will?
As far as leaders are foolish enough to allow it to escalate, unfortunately, we're 100 years on from some of the worst fighting in history in Europe in the First World War, the so-called war to end all wars. And it seems as though 100 years later, we still haven't learned the basic lessons of increasing levels of threat, bluster, saber rattling, escalation, mobilization, and eventually another war that no one wants and no one needs. And it's incumbent on leaders in NATO, in Russia, in the rest of Europe, frankly, in the rest of the world, to take that step back whenever things are escalating and to say, okay, there are provocations. Do we want to ratchet things up, or do we want to try and actually engage in some diplomacy and ratchet things down? And that's what NATO ought to be looking at doing, as should the Russian Federation, quite frankly.
Is that what the Russian Federation is looking at, Vladimir? Do they want to ratchet things up, and are we looking at a new Cold War here?
Yes. I would like to say that Russia, of course, is not. Again, I'm just reiterating myself again that Russia is not an enemy to any other country, and I can agree with the last presenter, with my colleague, esteemed colleague, that we should seek for diplomacy, for diplomatic negotiations to diffuse this ongoing crisis, because the whole history of the mankind was very full with a lot of wars, and no one in this world, in this fragile world, would like to have another war, especially when there are so many nuclear weapons, including the non-state actors, terrorism in the country. So I would like to say that instead of saber rattling, we need to use the force of diplomacy and to have diplomatic negotiations at any level, at the level of people, at level of the governments, at other levels.
But let me ask you this, Vladimir. What do you think Putin's long-term game with NATO is?
Well, I would like to say that again, that Russia is not going to start a war in Europe. This is definite, and it should be clear to anybody, you know. And I mean, President Putin made it clear during his speech in April when he was addressing the nation.
Right, but then if there is no threat, Vladimir Sotnikov, if there is no threat, then why is NATO going ahead with this? If they don't feel like there is a threat from Russia?
Well, you mean to say that there is do you really believe that there is an ongoing threat from Russia to any country, including Baltic states? This is just not like this, you know. I mean,
it's certainly not what I believe, but this is what some officials are saying, like Lithuanian officials, for example, who have said that they do not exclude Russian aggression. So I'm just trying to understand from you the Russian point of view here.
Well, we're trying to understand the logic of NATO, because we are trying to pick up the message, what is NATO is going to tell us by building up its forces around the Russian border. So that is actually not the act of diplomacy. This is just an act of I would say of unbelief in what are the true Russian intentions, and the true Russian intentions not making war but making peace actually.
Magnus, Vladimir was just talking about the message. So NATO Secretary General has said that this will bolster NATO's defenses against Russia while attempting to avoid any unwarranted escalations in tension with Moscow. So is NATO really succeeding in sending this message out?
Well, I hope they will succeed, and I agree with other speakers. No one wants a war here. It's a very serious matter. So I very much hope and believe that this build-up will be coupled with an attempted dialogue with Russia on a number of different issues. But I think it's important to be clear that actually Russia enjoys a distinct military advantage in this region. Here we're talking about four battalions going into the Baltic states and Poland, which is about 4,000 troops in total. The Russian force presence or posture in the Western Military District is far, far larger than that. And Russia has also announced the creation of additional divisions in the Western Military District. So for me, it's hard to understand how Russia believes that 4 battalions is a strategic threat to them.
Let me just ask you one thing on what NATO is doing, Magnus. And NATO defense ministers are reportedly going to discuss a new mission in the Mediterranean. This is a little bit off the subject of Russia, but do you know what that's about? NATO really faces 2 major strategic challenges currently. One is an assertive Russia in the east, another one is the continued turbulence in the Middle East and North Africa, the civil war in Syria and the rise of ISIS and so forth. And that is the response to that, the European response to the migrant crisis that flows from that has been very much an EU response. But there is perhaps a NATO mission to be filled here in terms of supporting the EU and supporting the southern members with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and assisting with missions at sea. And that is something that NATO's southern members have called for in order to gain a, if you will, a balanced approach between the southern challenge and the eastern challenge. Tetsi, how vulnerable, in your opinion, is NATO today?
I don't see any real enemies out there for the democratic alliance of Western Europe and the North Atlantic region. I honestly don't. I don't think that Russia is a military threat to NATO. I don't think that Iran is a military threat to NATO, even though that their missile defense system in Europe is supposedly geared to stopping the Iranian missile and possible nuclear weapon threat. I just think that the business of Western Europe and North America ought to be business, rather than looking for new Cold War boogeymen the way that NATO seems really intent on doing at this point. It's what George Kennan, the architect of the containment policy of the Soviet Union, probably the greatest American diplomat of the 20th century, and one who can't be accused of being any kind of sort of pro-Russian, lapdog. When he heard about the plans for continued NATO expansion closer and closer to Moscow in 1998, he told the New York Times, "This is madness. This is a bad idea. Russia will eventually react very badly." And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. And it's been the creation of Western policy in North America and in NATO Europe to keep pushing closer and closer to Moscow, even though NATO itself hasn't had a reason to exist since the end of the Cold War.
How much of this, though, I got to ask you, is driven by the economics of the U.S. military? There are some people who say that this NATO expansion is also all about money and that billions of dollars are going to be profited from this expansion of NATO, Tetsi.
I would say that the real economic issue here is prompting other NATO allies to put more than 2% of their gross domestic product into defense spending, which at the moment either 3 or 4 allies only are actually managing to do. That's the big economic issue with NATO as far as the U.S. is concerned. In terms of putting personnel on rotational basis in the Baltic states and/or Poland, that's not really much of an investment. Where the U.S. is investing its money right now is in modernizing all 3 legs of its nuclear triad: its nuclear bombers, its nuclear submarines, and its nuclear ICBMs. All of those are getting multi-billion-dollar facelifts right now, and that's the kind of U.S. military economic spending that we need to be looking at.
Vladimir, you keep talking about diplomacy and a strategy forward. What, in your opinion, must a coherent strategy in the region be actually built upon?
Well, actually, I can agree with what the previous speaker has rightly told about the prominent American political scientist, George Kennan, about the stupidity of encircling Russia, actually. I can only agree. I would like to say that in the world, in today's world, there are more specific threats, like, again, I'm probably repeating myself once again, international terrorism, just catastrophes, natural catastrophes, and other things, which we might unite all together just to fight with these global challenges. So why just be engaged in so-called tug of war, militarily speaking, because the diplomacy, and I truly believe, honestly, the diplomacy will eventually take a lead in all this world, because somehow in the future the Ukrainian crisis will be over. That's right, and we might be challenging the growing threat of jihadism from those conflict-prone areas like Middle East, like other countries. So again, I'm just insisting on my point that diplomacy should prevail.
Magnus, there was a report that was put out by the RAND Corporation, that's a think tank, and it says that Russian forces could overtake NATO in just 60 hours in the event of an invasion. How much is that? How much does that fear play into these decisions? And does the buildup of NATO military capabilities in the region alleviate those fears?
So that report has played a very important role in the debate here in Washington, but also in NATO. And that actually that game and that report actually shows that Russia enjoys a distinct military advantage in the region, and NATO is not the dominating power in the region. So certainly this buildup is a first response to a scenario like that. It may be quite arguably quite unlikely, but no longer impossible in today's security environment. And I think we will see more in the coming years in terms of logistics, air defense, and command and control arrangements in the region that will assist NATO in being able to better respond.
How much more? What do you mean by that?
I think I don't see a larger buildup in terms of boots on the ground, but there are other things that the alliance can do in terms of establishing command and control arrangements and reconnaissance and intelligence gathering capabilities and air defense systems and so forth in the region that will make deterrence, if you will, thicker on the ground and in the region than it currently is.
Ted C. in London, does the build-up in the Baltics, I see you shaking your head, so I'll give you a moment to respond to Magnus. And also, if you can answer this question, does the build-up in the Baltics and Eastern Europe violate the NATO Russia Founding Act? Putin claims to say that it does.
I think you'll find that it's very carefully crafted not to violate the letter of that agreement, although in my opinion it tears the spirit of that agreement to small shreds. The rotational basis of the deployment of these battalions is specifically designed not to violate the letter of the agreement. However, as I said, the spirit of that agreement is now in tatters on the ground. The problem that we have here is that there's still this feeling, this sort of neocon-driven military-industrial complex in the U.S. funded, and I must say that the RAND Corporation is a major part of that military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower first warned against even before 1960. The thing that's going on here is so reminiscent of 100 years ago, when it was actually bankers and arms manufacturers that were driving the policies of the major European powers towards confrontation and war so that everyone could profit, except, of course, the millions that died in the process. What we have here is a situation where the Cold War has been long over. Russia has not been engaging in provocative actions toward NATO or the West for years and years. And so, having been able to take the Russian Federation more or less for granted, NATO decided in the 90s and has continued ever since to expand eastward. We cannot forget that in 2001, on September 11th, following the attacks by international terrorism on major facilities in the U.S., the first foreign leader to contact President George W. Bush and offer his help and support was Vladimir Putin. We had Russian friendship in hand, we had Russian partnership in hand, and because of this insistence on brainless expansion eastward of NATO for no good reason, because frankly NATO lacks a reason to exist in the 21st century, but because we keep insisting on expanding, we've taken that friendship, that partnership, and we've thrown it away.
Vladimir, does NATO lack a reason to exist, as Ted C. is saying?
Well, yes, I wholly agree with the previous speaker, you know, because Russia, in fact, when there was this crisis at September 11, 2001, Russian President Vladimir Putin really was the first leader of any country of the world, among all countries, who actually just stretched a hand to the United States. And again, we are witnessing and facing now the very grave threat of international terrorism. So we must be fighting together. We must shoulder by shoulder unite our forces, not just separate by any threat perceptions or not threat perceptions, you know, or understanding what is the message or what is not the message. We must actually do what we should do. We must fight international terrorism. We must fight and we must cope with the global challenges which are facing the oncoming second half of the 21st century.
And let me just stick with you for one moment, Vladimir, here, and ask you the same thing that I put to Ted C., whether this buildup in the Baltics is violating the NATO Russia Founding Act, because Ted C. seems to say that the spirit of that agreement is in tatters in the ground. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree that this build-up actually violating the basic principles of the NATO-Russia agreement. You remember, may I just remind you that in the middle of the 90s, there was a founding act, the Partnership for Peace, and Russia was actually eagerly signed up this Partnership for Peace agreement, and that was the good example of cooperation between Russian Federation and NATO. So I think, I'm sure that this building up of the forces actually violating a lot of principles. First of all, this Partnership for Peace agreement.
Magnus, does NATO have a credibility issue here? Is it suffering from a credibility problem?
No, I don't think NATO has a credibility problem. Going back to the NATO Russia Founding Act, as we mentioned a few times here, and if you read it, it also refers to given the current security situation, NATO will not place forces in the east. And I would strongly argue that the security situation has radically changed over the last 5 years. So the principle that is being referred to may not remain. And in terms of NATO expansion, I'd like to point out that these were democratic, independent countries that sought membership in the Transatlantic Alliance. They were not forced into it. NATO did not seek them out. These were actually countries, Poland and the Baltic states and others, who saw this as a way to integrate themselves in a transatlantic community and solidify their democracy and solidify their free market connections and their commitment to strong European institutions. So in that sense, this was not a fly-by-night or a conspiracy. This was something that democratic, independent countries sought to associate themselves with. And should Russia have a veto over what organizations independent countries associate with?
On that note, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, Vladimir Sotnikov, Ted C. and Magnus Nordman. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story, and thank you for watching the show. You can always see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.